this computer. Thanks again for joining our call today. This session will be called Extinguishing the Fires Within Assessment and Grading Reform. It's being presented by First Education Resources. EDS and Otis are the proud sponsors of this session today. So as we kick this off, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about EDS and Otis. So EDS, we are an EdTech reseller that works in Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska. We've been helping schools for a little over 20 years now. My name is Aaron Eskeweeman. I work with EDS, and some of our partners that we work with include Nebraska ESUCC, Greenbush, AEA Purchasing in Iowa, and also EdPlus in Missouri. So EDS, we work with several different products, including Cloud9 World, a literacy-based SEL pre-K and 12 program, Schools PLP, an awesome program for credit recovery, virtual education, adult ed, certifications, and more. Our new courses, we refer to those as Netflix meets education. So if you haven't seen them, we'd love to get a chance to show it to you. And of course, we also work with Otis, used for data analytics, standard-based grading, plans, IPS goals, and many other things. So regarding Otis, their program, their tagline is maximizing every student's potential. They help schools gather, visualize, and act on student growth data with an all-in-one platform. This is just kind of a snapshot of some of the things that Otis does. So like I mentioned, it works with grading, progress monitoring, grading, data, assessments, integrations, and many other things. So once again, we'd love to be able to show that to you sometime down the road. So, but anyway, getting to our presenter, we are going to be talking about extinguishing the fires with assessments and grading reform. It's going to be presented today by Garth. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Garth.
All right, thanks so much, Aaron, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm just going to get my slides up here. Give me 1 second.
And Garth, I'll be monitoring chat, so I'll let you know if anything pops in or anything of that nature. So,
sounds good. Does this look okay to everybody? Can everybody see the screen all right? Okay, well, again, thanks so much for the introduction and the opportunity for me to present on our newest book that was literally just released here a few weeks ago, Extinguishing the Fires Within Assessment and Grading Reform. I'll explain a little bit about the book, why the book, as we go here. And actually, we're going to jump in and we're going to spend some time on some of the fires today, because the reality is, depending on where you're at, what role you serve in your school district, if you've tackled assessment and grading reform, if you're thinking about assessment and grading reform, these challenges are things that you will come up against. And really, it kind of started a few years ago. I was presenting at a conference, and I don't remember exactly how it came about, but like, we're just a school is working through some assessment and grading from. They're like, there's so many dumpster fires that we keep coming up against as we're trying to implement some of these changes. So that's kind of where this all kind of stemmed from, was here are some common challenges, but it was kind of presented as dumpster fires, that we've taken massage the language a little bit and really kind of put it in like, these are some common challenges that we see within schools. But before we get started, I just need to know, if you can, in the chat box, how are you feeling right now on the sheep scale? It is 11:35 a.m. It's getting toward the end of the school year. We are on May 8th. If you can, in the chat box, just go ahead. I just need to know, like, just a quick check-in. How are you feeling on the sheep scale right now? All right, we got a 3. We got a 3. All right, keep it. I wish, Megan and Shelly, I wish I could be a 3, but I was not blessed with that opportunity to be able to be that. So again, if you can, in the chat box, how are we feeling? This is something we do in Wisconsin. We utilize the sheep scale to check in with our people. Aaron, thank you. Yes, that's how I'm feeling right now. Any 4s? By the end, you will feel like a 4, I'm sure. Okay, thank you, Allison. Again, we got an 8. So, it's just a fun way to kind of check in. I actually just saw one the other day, a check in using facial expressions from David from Schitt's Creek, if you ever watched that show, which is also a fantastic way to check in with groups as you go. So I'm feeling like a 9 right now, and really excited to be able to share a little bit of this information with you when it comes to some of the common fires we see within assessment and grading reform. So as Aaron mentioned, my name is Garth Larson. A little bit about me: I'm the co-founder and CEO of the organization First Educational Resources. We are a customized PD company. We do a lot of support in schools. We have 9 different divisions. We've worked with just over 2,000 school districts internationally. One of the areas that we focus a lot with schools on is assessment and grading reform, getting that clarity in how we assess learning, how we communicate learning, how we give meaningful feedback to our students, and just making sure that what we do from classroom to classroom, school to school, is more consistent, accurate, learning focused, and meaningful for students and for their caregivers. Professionally, I was a director of teaching and learning in a K-12 school district in Northeast Wisconsin. I was an elementary principal where we had adopted standards-based grading practices at our elementary, and in the K-12 role that I served, we implemented standards-based grading across our entire district, K through 12. So a lot of the things we're going to talk about with some of these fires are definitely a little bit more secondary related, specifically some of the things that we see at high schools. And I still today consider myself a recovering high school English, speech, and journalism teacher. Also on a professional side, I've been able to be a part of some really fun and amazing publications. Some of the things we're going to talk about a little bit more are the 2 that you see on the right of your screen: a book that I wrote called Grading for Impact, that I co-authored with a gentleman by the name of Tom Herrick out of Canada. And then again, as we said, our most recent book, Extinguishing the Fires Within Assessment and Grading Reform. That's just my amazing family there. My wife, Tammy, who's our CFO at First, our 2 kids, Jackson and Maddie. The reason why I want to start with them, because this is going to be very important as we go through some of these changes, is I'm not presenting this information and how to overcome some of these challenges just through the lens of an educator. I'm also looking at it through the lens of a parent. Everything that I'm going to share with you in terms of the changes that are often made when it comes to assessment and grading reform, I've not only lived as an educator, I have lived through it as a parent. My son Jackson is a freshman in high school. He goes to high school in a school that incorporates standards-based grading, assessment, and reporting practices. My daughter is a 7th grader. She goes to a middle school that has incorporated such practices. And so I think that's really important, because often when we think about the challenges we face when it comes to assessment and grading reform, it's not typically, yes, there are some internal challenges that we face as educators, but the biggest thing we think about is how are our parents going to respond to this? What does that look like when it comes to their communication with colleges and universities? All of these things that are real challenges that we are up against, I can wholeheartedly tell you that I've lived through it with my own kids and also have experienced the benefit from it. So as we go, just know that I'm looking at it through that lens as well. I am joining you this morning, and I'm just going to say it for you, from Winneconne, Wisconsin. That is how you pronounce that. Winneconne is a smaller community just outside of Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Just by either thumbs up or in the chat box, show of hands, how many of you have heard of Oshkosh, Wisconsin? Okay, and if you have, it's more than likely you've heard of it because of what you see on the screen here. Okay, so yes, Oshkosh B'gosh, it is the home of Oshkosh B'gosh, although about 10 plus years ago, Oshkosh B'gosh got sold to Carter Kids brand. But this is an actual picture of the outlet mall in our community. It is a requirement that all kids have to wear bib overalls until the age of 12, and then we let them progress into other clothing. So that's a little bit of where I'm joining you from. Oshkosh is about 45 minutes south of Green Bay, about an hour and a half north of Milwaukee. Now, I do want to start as we go into this, because I know we only got about 35, 40 minutes to kind of work through some of these, is I want to share a public service announcement. I am incredibly passionate about what I'm about to talk about. Okay. And sometimes in my passion, I can be overly expressive and maybe have a little bit too, almost like I've had like 10 cups of coffee. But I really strongly believe that we can do better on behalf of our kids if we just think a little bit differently about how we communicate their learning with them through assessments, through grade books, through report cards. And one of the things I really love about the relationship and partnership that we have with Otis is a really good wait a second, Megan, you were born in La Crosse? Okay, hold on, sorry. I was born about 30 minutes south of La Crosse, so a little town called Viroqua. So we'll see if you can recognize that name. But ultimately, as we look at this, I just share that my passion is going to come through with this. And if there are questions through that passion, please put those in the chat box, and I want to make sure you have a chance. But I know we can do better on behalf of kids. And I was saying about Otis, they have a great platform to be able to communicate learning in more meaningful ways. And I think that's always, again, I'm not going to talk about that challenge on this particular webinar, but that is a challenge we're running up against, is within our learning management systems, within our student information systems, how do those all integrate together? And then how do we utilize other types of LMSs like an Otis or something like that to be able to better communicate? So if you're not as familiar with the platform, as Aaron said at the start, it's really worth chatting with the folks there, because it is a great solution. It's a great tech solution to what a lot of schools are trying to accomplish with more meaningful communication within assessment and grading. But the first thing I want to share, and I learned this from the great Dr. Tom Gusky years ago, is that when it comes to assessment and grading reform, method follows purpose. And what we mean by that is method, how we grade, follows purpose, why we grade. We need to establish the reason for grading in the first place before we go down the trajectory of looking at how we want to grade. And I think this is really important. And obviously, if we were, having a longer workshop, we'd actually take some time. We develop a purpose statement, but I'm going to give you one to work from as we go today. And this was the one that we adopted in our own district as we were going through a lot of these changes, which is the purpose of a grade is to communicate student achievement accurately and honestly based on clearly articulated learning and behavioral goals. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, and establish criteria at a specific point in time. So I want to start with that, because from the rest of this conversation today, it's all going to be related to how do we ensure that we do this? And that's why it's so important to establish a purpose statement around grading before you go into how you grade. Before you go, like a lot of schools say, well, we heard a lot of districts are moving towards standards-based grading. Well, do we know why they're moving towards standards-based grading? Why is standards-based grading the solution for what you're aiming to accomplish? And that's why this piece is important. So takeaway number one, hopefully, is if you're looking at a pathway of revisiting, or you're down a pathway of assessment and grading reform, make sure you have this really crystal clear for your folks, because this allows us then to look at any of our practices, any of our policies, any of our procedures, and indicate, is what we're doing aligned with our purpose? And if it isn't, then we need to reconsider a little bit of what we're doing. And so that's just something to start with. Now, when it comes to this webinar, Extinguishing the Fires Within Assessment and Grading Reform, when it comes to the book itself, I do think it's important to know what we mean when we say changes or reform within assessment and grading. So we have our purpose statement, right? That's kind of what we're aiming to do within grading. But now, what are some of the common changes that we see schools incorporate when it comes to their reform efforts? And there's so many great resources out there, and different people and different thought leaders that are talking about the changes they want to see in the schools. But what we've tried to do here at FIRST, and in particular at the Stagger Center, which is one of our divisions, Standards, Targets, Assessment, Grading, and Reporting, we've tried to narrow it down to kind of 4 key points. The first big reform effort as a part of these changes is formative practice, right? That we redefine the purpose of formative practice, and that it really is just about practice. And so things that we have traditionally used within our grading structures, homework, quizzes, labs to a degree, maybe labs might be a part depending on what the outcome is from that lab, but anything that's meant to just be kind of quick checks along the way, that we don't grade that. We can give feedback on it. We can still let our learners know where they are, but it doesn't go into that end evaluation of where a student is at the end of a semester, at the end of a trimester, at the end of a year, whenever your grading structures take place. So that's the first big change. The second one is reassessment. And then we're going to talk about this one a little bit when it comes to one of the fires, because in schools that have adopted these reform efforts, reassessment is a natural part of what they do, because we agree that not all kids learn at the exact same rate, the exact same time, in the exact same way, and are demonstrating that learning on this point in time within our school year. So schools that have adopted these reform efforts have found ways to make reassessment work. Now, again, this is without penalty, meaning that we don't penalize a kid for not getting it the right way, but not without a process. Like we incorporated reassessment years ago in our school district and it went horribly wrong because we didn't have a process. So there does need to be a process, and we won't be able to get into that today with this webinar, but we have a lot of resources that we've developed to help schools accomplish and make reassessment doable. The third key kind of big idea within the reform effort is that we separate the academics from the non-academics and we report those two things differently. Because I think we can all agree, we want to make sure that we know specifically where our kids are in their learning journey, right? We want to know where they are within those academic outcomes, those standards, those targets, however you refer to them in your schools. But we equally want to know, how are our kids doing when it comes to those approaches to the learning in school? Whether you want to call them life skills, job skills, employability skills, citizenship. I've seen schools use a variety of different terms, but really what we're talking about is, how are they doing with those learner behaviors? And that is a key piece that we want to make sure, because those, again, are important. I will tell you this, as a parent, I care just as much about how my kids act, behave, collaborate, work with each other in a class as I do on how they do within the academic outcomes. Academic outcomes are important, but if they do these things well, and we have a way to know that they're doing those things well, we now know that we're creating more well-rounded learner and that they're going to be successful when they leave us. The last then key big idea from this is that when it comes to a grade in our classes, in our schools, in our districts, that the grades we determine, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, it does not mean just, standards-based grading does not mean that you still can't have some type of a letter achievement summary symbol. You can have a letter grade, you can have a numerical grade, you can have a Bitmoji, it does not matter. But whatever that symbol represents, that you communicate with students and their caregivers, that it is based on how proficient they are on those identified academic outcomes. And I'm going to show you a little bit of what I mean by that as we go. So those are the four big ideas. So just to quickly go over those, formative practice is not counted within an academic grade. We have a process for reassessment without penalty, that we separate academics from behaviors and report those in two different ways and give feedback and communication on that. And then when we assign a grade, an academic grade, that the academic grade we assign is based on how proficient that learner is on those academic outcomes. So as a result of incorporating those four big ideas, these are some common fires. And just, to give you a little bit of background on this, these are all real. These are all things that we've heard either teachers say to us when we've been working with schools on this, that we've heard principals or administrators say, that we've heard parents say, that we've heard school boards say. These are all real situations. These aren't rhetorical. These are not just like a hypothetical, this might be something you heard. These are things we've actually heard. And so without going into too much detail, I'm going to focus today on fires 7 through 10, which is fire 7. Why would we switch practices if we're still giving a letter grade? Isn't that against the kind of the rules and regulations of standards-based grading? Talk about that. The second one, these changes that we're doing won't prepare students for the real world or for college. The third one is, won't this system just promote laziness? Where's the accountability to kids? And then the last one is, if you incorporate these practices, my kid won't be able to get into college or get a job because the schools won't understand what you're doing. And so it's really hard to cover these in a quick time frame, but I'm going to kind of go rapid fire with it. And then I know there is some time for questions at the end where I can go back and share some of that. But as I mentioned, these are the four fires that we're going to quickly work through today, that if you can at least get in the right mindset around these, and if you're having these conversations in your schools and you're looking at this can help you. The goal behind this book, behind this webinar, behind any of the work that we do in schools is to help you overcome those challenges, because we have seen schools that have started down this pathway. They've come up against these fires and they've retreated. They don't have the right tools. They don't have the right knowledge. They don't have the right supports to be able to continue to do what they're doing with the best of intentions, which is to have those more meaningful communications around student learning with kids and their caregivers. So that's what we're going to try to get through in about the next 20, 25 minutes. I know it's a lot. It kind of feels, I don't know if there's any dodgeball fans on here, but it's a bold strategy to try to do, but we're going to try to work through it and make it happen. So here's the first fire that we're going to talk about. Like I said, and we don't, unfortunately, not going to be able to go into all of the depth on when and how. We do kind of detail out like what was the context of this fire, but this is a very common one that I've heard. And the first piece is, why would we still switch practices? Why would we go through the reform effort if at the end of the day we might still be communicating a letter grade? Isn't that against, as I mentioned, kind of the thoughts and ideas around standards-based grading? And one of the first things I want to start with as we extinguish this fire is there are a lot of perspectives out there. And I just want to share, I'm here to offer a perspective on this one. I'm not saying that I'm the right perspective. There are different people that are very, very well educated, that have very, very good rationale and ideas for what they do. This is my perspective. And the first thing we have to ask ourselves around whether or not we still are going to give a letter grade for a high school class, a middle school class, even if maybe if you're elementary folks, whatever it may be, if we're still going to summarize student achievement, it has to be based on this question: what your community will accept. Meaning this, in our district, when we went through the full reform process around assessment, grading, reporting, we had to look at our community. We had to look at the general dynamic of our community and said, if we were to move away from communicating student achievement through the form of a letter grade, what would the end result would be? What would the end result be? And I can wholeheartedly tell you that the result would not have been good. We would have had a significant amount of pushback, because the one thing I can tell you is the letter grade is still very familiar to them. So what we said is, we can still have the symbol. The symbol does not matter. And I think most people have come to that conclusion that have researched and done this work. Then most people say it does not matter what the summary symbol is. It's a matter of what does that symbol represent. So in our opinion, keep the symbol that's most familiar to people. But how we get to the symbol is what's going to look a little bit different within this reform process. And this was kind of my aha moment, because I would have been one of those people years ago, 10 years ago. Like I said, I think my first go at standards-based was about 14 years ago. But I would have been one of the people that said we should get rid of letter grades that have no intention or purpose within what we're doing. And that's too much about chasing the grade and not chasing the learning. My aha moment was when I was working with a school district and we were kind of having this conversation. And one thing that I recognize is that summary symbol. And then I learned, and now I see it also through a parent lens. That summary symbol of that letter grade can be incredibly powerful as a first form of communication. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to give you an example. This is from a school district. It's just a sandbox example. But you can see here to think of that letter grade as nothing more than a summary of the learning that has taken place. And I think the difference is if that letter grade is solely just based on the points that have been accumulated in the course of a semester, that is not meaningful. But if that summary is kind of that first attempt in communication to tell a deeper story of where the kid is, now it can be very helpful. So I'm giving you an example here, and I'm not saying it's the best one, but this is one that I have a permission to share, okay? And so in this particular school, you can see that they have a combination. They have a combination of a summary symbol of that letter grade, the familiar for what the community and the parents understand. But what you will notice is how they get to that letter grade is very different, because they're getting to that letter grade based on proficiency scores. So you can see on this particular social studies example that the student has a 2 in key terms related to government and citizenship, and they have a 2 in describing the process of becoming a U.S. citizen. You will also notice that they have 2 3s there. Now, for this district, they have a conversion scale that determines that based on your proficiency scores, this is where that would land you in terms of your overall grade within the class. And so again, I want you to look here at this next, hold on. This next piece here, which is the B is representative of proficiency. So if I'm a student, if I'm a parent, I have so much more clarity in why I'm getting the grade I'm getting. I remember I would have to say, or if I was a learner, if I was getting a B in a class and I was thinking, well, what do I need to do next? I just need to get a higher percentage on the next test, and that's going to bump my score up, my percentage. Has nothing to do with what I've learned or what I haven't learned. This one says, all right, and going back to those 4 pillars I introduced at the start, this says, you're not yet proficient on key terms related to government and citizenship and describing the process of becoming a U.S. citizen. Now that becomes the focal point for reteaching, relearning, and reassessment, because you're not there yet on those. So the key point behind this one really is to get to the idea of, if that summary symbol is a reflection of proficiency, then it's still perfectly fine, in my opinion, just my perspective, to keep it there. If you don't think that, and again, we have schools that have looked at this a little bit differently to say, we just want to give an overall number. That's great. Maybe you'd have then a process to say, here's your overall numerical score for this. But again, it comes back to, what is it that you're trying to communicate, and what will your community tolerate? You can still accomplish the core values of assessment and grading reform, standards-based grading, target-based grading, however you refer to it, evidence-based, proficiency-based, and still have something that's going to allow you to move this journey forward by keeping that familiar for your families. And then again, if you still want to know, you can take a deeper look. So that first form was the letter grade of communication. The second form was the proficiency scores. And if you want to, and again, this kind of goes back to our folks at Otis, you can do this information in there too, as I can see, when was that standard or target assessed? All right, that was assessed on the Unit 1 assessment, or it was assessed there and it was reassessed again 2 weeks later. I can see that information. The end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to, within this process, gain more clarity for our students and for their caregivers on what they're doing well and what they need to improve upon within this reform effort. Because I think the question is, what gives us better information? Does this give us better information in terms of seeing a general homework score, general quizzes, 50 out of 50, 10 out of 10, 70 out of 100, which tells me nothing in terms of what my child knows and can do? Or is it more effective to see something like this? And this is, I like to embarrass my kids. So this is a example, a high school example of what a report card can look like. And it also showcases the separation of the non-academics from the academics. So you can see in each one of his classes, here is where, and I know it's really hard to see, and I'm happy to share this with anybody that emails me after the fact. But here's where the overall approach to learning, how well he's doing when it comes to those learner behaviors. And on the right side, you can see there is a overall summary grade for each of those classes. And then those numbers those are each of the learning targets in those classes and his current proficiency scores on there. So I can easily look at it and say, you know what, I know that, and some schools will have it fully listed. His school district doesn't. But ultimately, I can see that in Algebra 1, if he wants to get better, I need to know, what is that target for 3C? And I need to say, hey, what's your plan to increase your proficiency on that target? Well, he could always say, here's what I'm going to be doing. I go in for a reteach session at this time. I'm retaking it next week during focus time. So much more clear. Yet we still have that, again, going back to this original fire, we still have that summary symbol there that represents how proficient he is on those outcomes. So that's fire number one. I'm just making sure nothing in the chat box so far, right, Aaron? In terms of, if there's questions, feel free to pop those in as I'm going through this. Next one of my favorite fires, okay? These changes won't prepare our students for the, quote, real world. And what I will say when it comes to extinguishing this fire, this one is very much related to the reassessment conversation. So if you're looking at trying to create opportunities for students to engage in retakes or reassessment, that's what this one is about. Because we'll often hear, like, in the real world, you don't get a second chance. And when you get out there, and I think the one thing I want to start with is, if we want to entertain this conversation, and I used to say this, again, I will always admit when I was wrong as an educator, which was frequent. I used to say this to my high school kids all the time. In the real world, when you get out of here, this is what life is going to be like. And we use this to kind of weaponize and scare our kids of what the world is going to be like when they're not with us. And I think we really need to stop using that phrase. If I think about what the last 4 years has brought for our students, when I think about our mental health crisis, when I think about looking at what a lot of our learners are experiencing in their home environment, I think they're living in a very real world right now. So if we can, maybe just another point to take away, if we can begin to change the conversation to, will this prepare them for when they're not with us? Great, let's have that dialogue. Let's work through that entire situation of whether our students are going to 4-year college, 2-year college, technical college, apprenticeship, military, gap year, workforce, whatever it may be. Great, let's talk about that. And again, I want to make sure that This fire is most directly related to schools that are trying to incorporate retakes or reassessment. So I want to explain a conversation. This is from a district, again, that I've been working with and gotten to know for years. And a couple years ago at one of our stagger conferences, we asked this middle school healthy living team to present to in kind of breakout groups to a light group. So they are working with FIED teams from all over the country that are working on assessment and grading reform. And a question came up to Ashley. Ashley's the teacher on the far right. She was in her first year of teaching there. She'd just come out of the universities. And they said, but what you're doing there with retakes and reassessment, everything, that's not preparing them for college. And this was some people that had been out of college for a while. And this was her quote: "If you don't think the universities are beginning to head in this direction, you are wrong." And she said, now again, it depends on the university, it depends on, but ultimately universities are moving much toward making sure that we're proficient in the skills we need in whatever those majors are. So yeah, maybe not so much in your general electives, but if we are really aiming to get our students more proficient, that is the focal point. And so, you know, this was directly from a teacher that had just come out of a university system that said they're more concerned about making sure that we can demonstrate proficiency of being a teacher than whether or not we got it the first time. And I thought that was a really powerful statement. But I do want to share a non-education example in terms of kind of the real world that we use to say why kids shouldn't get a second chance, even though we all know that life is about second chances. It's about recovering from situations. I was on a flight from Appleton, Wisconsin to Columbus, Ohio to go work with a school district down there. And I just so happened to be sitting next to a gentleman that was reading this book, Norman Hall's police exam preparation book. And I kind of leaned over to the gentleman and I said, "Oh, are you going to school to become a police officer? Like, why else would he be reading this book?" But he was very kind and said, like, "You idiot, I'm not just reading this for fun." And he said, "Yes, I am." I said, "Well, when do you take your test?" He said, "Well, I already took it and I failed." I said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. I said, "If you're reading Norman Hall's police exam preparation book, do you get a second chance?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Talk to me about that process." He said, "What do you mean?" I go, "Like, what does that look like?" He goes, "Well, I have to prepare and take it again. And when I pass, if I pass the next time, I move on." I said, "Is there any penalty at all?" I'm like, "Do they take your first score and average it with your second score?" He's like, "No." I said, "If you pass it the second time, do you have to have like an asterisk or something special that you wear on your uniform that says I failed the police exam preparation exam the first time around?" He kind of laughed. He's like, "No." I said, "So there's nothing that indicates that even though you didn't get it the first time, that the next time when you pass it, that indicates that you failed the first time?" He's like, "No." He said, "The only thing I do have to do is I have to wait 2 weeks. I cannot take the exam for 2 weeks." And he said, "There's a penalty. Got to pay for it. Got to pay for that second time around." But what was interesting was he made this statement. He said, "All the department cares," and I thought this was profound, "all the department cares about is that I can demonstrate a clear understanding of the rules and regulations to effectively be an officer in the community I serve, not that I didn't get it the first time." This is what life is. This is the real world. I know some fantastic educators that I worked with as a principal, that I worked with when I was in a director of teaching and learning role, that failed the Praxis 1 or 2. And they were some of the most fantastic, dynamic educators I've ever seen. But they didn't get it the first time, and we realized that's the way things work. Now, the last thing I want to share with this particular fire, because I know we're down to about 11 minutes here. Aaron, am I good on that? I'm still got about 11 to 15. Okay, perfect. Is a story from our own high school graduation. Now, the way it works in the district that my kids go to, that I was director of teaching and learning in, the way it works is we moved away years ago from like weighted classes, so you can't get more than a 4.0 GPA or anything like that. We moved away from class rank, all that type of stuff. We have more of a Laude system. So if you graduate with high honors, you're recognized that. Well, if you go through our high school and you've met the criteria, which would be that you've essentially proficient across the board in all your classes, you've earned the right to be a valedictorian in our high school. And I know it's a little bit crazy, but we feel that if they've accomplished that honor, they've all earned that honor. So the way it happens at graduation is nobody wants to see 5, 7, 10 valedictorian speeches. That'd be for a very long night. So the students that meet that criteria, they give a graduation speech together. They give that valedictorian speech together. And so in this particular year, this was years ago now, this was kind of in our middle to later stages of implementation of our assessment and grading reform efforts. The students got up, and the student on the left, Morgan, was the first one to go. Now, the thing to know is that this group of graduating seniors had been through everything when it comes to the assessment and grading changes that we made in our school district. When they were in middle school, they were in a traditional grading scale. Then we adopted a 12-point scale for proficiency. We then began to incorporate reassessment practices. We separated non-academics from academics. Then they moved into a 3-point scale, and then finally kind of had the whole package in place. So if there was a group that had been through a lot of change, like they had kind of been in the middle of it, and then at this point we were kind of at the point of implementation, it was this group. And every year prior, the graduations, valedictorian speeches, they had always made a little bit of a joke, like about the grading changes and what we were doing. And so imagine now you're in this field house, you're looking ahead to the front, there's bleachers going up each side, all of the faculty sitting in the very back of the field house where I took this picture from. And Morgan started with, welcome, graduating class, kind of did the initial thing. She said, for this year's valedictorian speech, we're going to look at life through the lens of a retake. And I kid you not, I broke out into a full sweat. I'm not even joking on this. I took out my phone and I started looking on WeCan. And if you're not familiar with what WeCan in Wisconsin, that is the employment network for educators. I was worried I was going to get fired, right? Because a lot of these changes were things that I've been pushing because I knew they were right for kids and everything. I'm like, oh my gosh, the whole speech is about this. Everything is going wrong. And she goes, look, what we've been doing here at Winneconne High School with retakes is what is about life. She said, in life, we are going to fail over and over again, just like some of us have along the way here at school. And it's not about the failure. It's about how we respond to the failure. How do we react to that failure? How do we improve as a result of that failure? Because life is full of second chances and third chances. And it was one of those things where it went from I was nervous to like sobbing tears of joy, because it was like this culminating moment that the kids got it. The kids understood the purpose of why we're doing this, because it's not just about giving them the second chance. It's about giving them a process to learn, like when you don't do well, here's what you need to do to improve. And we're going to give you those opportunities to improve. And when you're now in a better place, we're going to communicate that the right way. I also maybe looked at a few parents in the audience that had said some not so many nice things about me on Facebook. And I said, are you listening to what she's saying? And they all went through the entire process of this speech, talking about life through the lens of a retake. And I'm like, this is what it's all about. This is the purpose behind what we're doing. And if you can, and I just want, when you think about any of these potential fires that you might be up against as you're working on this, if you can make sure that the teachers, the students, that they fully understand A, why we do it, and B, how we can successfully do it, you can overcome any challenges or resistance that you might hear from, whether it be from other educators about, in this scenario, you don't get a second chance. Yeah, there are a lot of scenarios, a lot of professional situations where we don't get second chances. But guess what? They've gone through the full learning process. Pilots have gone through the simulation process before they ever land a plane the first time on their own. They have gone through that. And we can talk about numerous professions where it's a part of the training. And these are our high schoolers. It's a part of them learning. So we should be able to give them that second opportunity. Third quick fire here. Won't the system just promote laziness? There's no accountability for this. And here's the one way I want to make sure that we begin to extinguish this fire is we really have to understand and think about how we define accountability. Too often we want to use grading as a form of compensation, either for positive accountability or for negative accountability. And we want to use that grade as the tool that's going to be how we hold the students accountable, versus if we go back to that purpose statement that I said, that it's really just about communicating accurately and honestly in relation to where kids are on the academic outcomes and our behavioral outcomes. And that's really what we mean. We need to really shift our thinking and rethink a little bit of what we mean when we say accountable. And I want to give you an example. And this is going to tie to kind of the accountability side for kids going through the reassessment process. Because one of the things that we'll hear is, well, you know, kids are just gonna not take it seriously the first time, and it's gonna be a free for all. And by the way, that was what it looked like initially for us. We had prescribed to the philosophy of retakes, and we had no process in place. And so our kids would walk in, seriously, they would walk in, they'd ask, when's the retake? Like, you haven't even taken the first one yet. The second thing they would say is like, you know, I'd rather see what's on the first one, and then I'll try to study harder for the second one. You know, all these things that we'd see, like, we just didn't have, they'd even just write, they wouldn't even fill out the assessment. They just write retake on the top. Now you can imagine that didn't sit very well with our teachers. So what we did is we had to establish a process. One way is what we call our retake tickets. So as you can see on this example, is that, you know, these are some non-negotiables when it comes to the reassessment process, including things like, if you have any missing practice around that target or standard that you're not proficient on, you got to do that, because obviously you're not there yet. Some might have to do test corrections. Some might have to come in for a reteach session. All we're saying is there's actually quite a bit of accountability to you to earn the right. We just want to keep that window of opportunity open. We don't just want to slam that door and say, you know what, you didn't get it the first time. Sorry, good luck, and create a bigger gap for their learning. Another example of what this looks like with accountability is through the separation of the non-academics from the academics. So in this case, this is a real example from my own kids' high school. I'd like to bring the parental side into it, where in their classes, and you could kind of see it quickly on that grade report I showed you, but in their classes, they get an overall academic grade, and then they get actually in each of their classes 3 behavioral grades, like how they approached. And the way it is around kindness, respect, and work to do best, work ethic. Now, in terms of the way we hold them accountable is if they get a 1 in anything, which means they're rarely meeting the behavioral expectation, they lose merit points, meaning our privileges within the building. Or taking it a little bit further, we actually, I just want a disclaimer, it took us a little time to get to this point. We tie all of our co-curricular activities to that learner behavior rubric that we are doing in each one of our high school classes. So if you get a 1 in you know, he's a freshman, he gets a 1 in bio, in anyone in that class, he's a golfer, he'd have to sit out a golf meet. So we actually have a significant amount of accountability that are tied to it. We did not do that in the first year of the reform process. We did it once we had a clear understanding of, here's the academic outcomes, here's the behavioral outcomes. And then once we had a full year for our students to understand what that looked like, then we started to ramp up and tie accountability. So I actually would say that we have a higher amount of accountability when it comes to this system of reform than what we did before, because a kid could do a lot, you know, to get away with being a jerk to somebody else in class, or not doing some of that practice, and it would just get blended. It was just blended into a hodgepodge grade. Versus this is now much clearer. Here's where you are academically, here's where you are behaviorally, and we have a high level of accountability tied to that one. Final fire here in the last kind of couple minutes here, and we're going to wrap up. And this is another one. My kid won't be able to get into college or get a job because schools won't understand what you're doing. And the one thing we'll say in terms of that is there's just nothing further from the truth. Now, as I showed you at the start of this webinar, one, you can still have letter grades. You can still have things that look very familiar to the colleges and the universities when it comes to the application process. And again, it goes back to what will your community tolerate? But what I do want to say is, let's say you decide to do something a little bit differently. Let's say you move away from letter grades and you're just going to communicate proficiency scores on there. And parents will push back and say, well, the universities, you're going to put my kid in a disadvantage. So the one thing we did, our team at first, and within the Stagger Center, we decided to reach out to the universities and ask them, like, if you saw a transcript that looked different than a traditional transcript, would that put a kid at a disadvantage? And here was the interesting part. When talking with admissions offices, they said, let me ask you a question. Do you believe that the only applications we get are from students in the US? We're like, oh, no, not really. So we get, the one university, we get applications from students from 110 different countries that come here. And not all 110 countries use the traditional model that the US uses or has traditionally used when it comes to grading. Like we can't discriminate against a kid because their transcript looks different. We get kids from different countries. We get kids that are homeschooled. We get personal narrative transcripts. We get portfolios. We get all this type of stuff. The only thing you've done with traditional money is just made it a little bit easier for us to look at some different factors, but we can't actually hold them accountable to it. And it was one of those moments like, oh my gosh, how arrogant are we as a system to think that our traditional model is the only model that's used out there? And it was like another aha moment for me to say, okay, you're right. So we can put things into practice. But what I've learned also is usually when parents are saying that the colleges won't understand, even when we still had traditional, we still had a letter grade as a summary symbol. We had a lot of what that would look different in terms of what it meant, is when we even had parents say, colleges aren't accepting what you're doing. I called them, they just had misinformation. They didn't have an understanding of what we were doing. So it does go back to, as we wrap up this last fire, it does go back to the clarity that we want to see within how we're assessing, how we're communicating with students and their caregivers through those grade books and through those report cards, and just making sure that people fully understand that purpose for why we grade, and then what it looks like when we actually do grade. So within this, I know that was a rapid fire. Normally go through these and take time for a little bit more processing, or when we run workshops around this. But hopefully these are just kind of 4 fires of the big picture, right? Like I said, there's 16 different fires that we've established in here that we go into much more depth, that we give, examples on what that looks like. If you are, a shameless plug, but I have 2 kids with braces, so I'm going to make a shameless plug to sell a few more books. But ultimately, if you do want to order the book, this is a QR code where you can order on Amazon, or you can order directly on our website at First. We would love, like we said, we do believe it is built out of practicality. A lot of people have already purchased it and have already said, like, this is just helpful in terms of our journey. But I'm going to just leave that up for a second in case you need to take a screenshot. And then I have 2 slides there, and then I'm going to wrap up. And we can also have any of the folks send this out to you in terms of those links. So the last thing is, if you want others to kind of go through and learn a little bit more about this, we do have another free webinar on this next week at 4:00 Central with all of the authors. So there's actually 4 of us that wrote the book together. If you just go to our website, firsteducation-us.com, and click on events, you can see Extinguishing the Fires. Also, just wanted to let you know that we will be in the Kansas City area, May 29th through May 31st in Olathe Public Schools, doing a Culturize Institute. That's more on kind of the pillars of Culturize, and it's not just a culture conference. It's really about how do you live kind of the core pillars of expecting excellence, carry the banner, be a merchant of hope, and supporting students every single way. Got keynotes there from LaVonna Roth, Ken Williams, Greg Wolcott, Rufus Slott. We also have keynotes from Jimmy Casas in Chicago, La Crosse, Wisconsin, going back to originally Megan, where you were born, where we have some of those going on. So if any of those work, you can go to our website. And then the last one is, if any of you are looking to dive in deeper on these fixes and you want to come to one of the coolest cities in the US, we do have a 2-day event in August 7th and 8th called Simplifying Standards-Based Grading. It's at the Wilderness Resort and Conference Center in Wisconsin Dells. If you're not familiar with Wisconsin Dells, it's the water park capital of the world. It's a great place to take families to. And this will be right at a water park resort. Again, you can see that on our website. So appreciate the opportunity. Really thank all of the parties involved with allowing me to come and share a little bit more. Just if there's questions, I'll stick around and answer any questions that we have. Otherwise, I hope to connect with you again in the future.
Hey, at this point, we'll open it up to any questions that anybody may have. Garth, thank you again for joining us today to go over this important conversation and all the above. So one of the other things I added to the chat, as we mentioned earlier, and some of the things that Garth had showed, Otis is one of the sponsors of this program, and they do an unbelievable job of showing standard-based grading, showing different things with assessments, number of takes, things of that nature. We will be hosting a session next week to learn more about Otis. So if you're interested in attending that, there's a registration link in the chat now. And once again, if you've got any questions, feel free to come off mute or ask questions. Otherwise, thank you again for attending today.
Any questions that I can answer? Anything you want me to go back and that you want to see again? If anybody wants to, someone mentioned they wanted to see that grade report. Here's my email address. Obviously, it's on the screen as well. If you shoot me an email, I'm happy to send you a screenshot of what that looks like in terms of like taking the proficiency scores and then also having those scores along with an overall letter achievement grade. And then you also notice the separation of the non-academics from the academics. I'm happy to share that with anybody. Like I said, I like embarrassing my kids. So anytime I could use examples from him, I'm going to make sure it's my way to kind of leverage him a little bit. Like, hey, I use your report card in presentation. So maybe if you cannot let that dip down, that would be great. So any questions from the group, either in the chat box or if you want to take your microphones off, happy to talk through any of this. All right.
And stop the record.
And I will just say the last thing.